Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Design, Deploy, and Optimize Microsoft SharePoint on AWS session. Very happy to have you here with us. My name is Lou Delatorre. I'm a solutions architect with AWS. I've been with AWS now for about 2 years, and I have over 2 decades experience working with systems architecture, cloud architecture, contingency planning, compliance management, systems management, of course, Microsoft workloads. With me, I have Zlatan Zinic, and he'll introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Zlatan. I'm a senior architect for professional services, AWS team, and this is literally a 4th continent that I live and work on. I have more than 20 years experience in the industry. I've been Microsoft's most valuable professional for SharePoint for many years, and I've gone through the Microsoft Certified Master Certification and training in the past while it was still around. I have very, very deep and extensive SharePoint experience, and I'd love to talk to you about running SharePoint on AWS today. But Lou is going to start off first, so go ahead, Lou.
Great. Thank you, Zlatan. So today we're going to talk about, as Zlatan mentioned, everything on SharePoint on AWS. And we're going to start off with the fundamentals, talking about initially EC2 networking, Active Directory, remote access, and purchasing options for your SharePoint environments on AWS. We're not going to go deep into each of those because there's other sessions that cover that. But it's important to understand those fundamentals if you're new to AWS and it's going to be your first experience deploying SharePoint on AWS. So once we get through the fundamentals, Zlatan will take over and cover the architectural scenarios. So marketplace builds that are available for SharePoint, hybrid configurations for SharePoint, multi-AZ SharePoint deployments. Also talk a little bit about SharePoint 2016 on AWS and some DevOps using some tools that we have that can help speed up the deployment of SharePoint on AWS using our Quick Start. And then finally, we'll cover some best practices for SharePoint on AWS, from EC2 best practices to SQL best practices, talk about migration best practices, and then some additional things you may want to consider taking advantage of as you deploy SharePoint on AWS, because now you're going to have a plethora of services that are going to be available to you within the AWS Cloud Platform that you may want to take advantage of. So some things to think about there. But let's first get started with the fundamentals with regards to VPC patterns that we see commonly deployed on AWS. Typically, you'll see any one of these 4 VPC patterns, starting with an internal-only VPC pattern where you might have a VPC with private subnets that have connectivity back to an on-premises data center for internal-only communication, and that's something that would only be accessible internally, such as your on-prem network with your VPC resources, and your SharePoint environment would be an internal-only type setup. So that's one example. Another is internet accessible VPC, where in this case it's isolated perhaps from your internal on-premises network, or maybe it's an all-in solution where you only have a VPC in the cloud with public subnets and an internet gateway that provides you access to the internet for those instances. So that may be used, for example, for test, R&D, or maybe as an environment to demonstrate a sales demo tool, for example. Other customers may use it for production. It may just be something that they provide access to externally for whatever business requirements they may have. And then in the third scenario, you see that we have a public and privately routed VPC. And here you have, again, private and public subnets. And the public subnets, again, have access to external or to the internet via the internet gateway, whereas your private resources have internal-only communications within the private subnets. They would not have a route, for example, to the internet gateway that would give them access or accessibility to resources in the internet. There's some other ways of accomplishing that we'll talk about shortly, as far as providing internal private resources access to public resources in a secure fashion. But in this scenario, you would isolate that communication and keep them separate. And then finally, we have the on-premises and internet accessible VPC. So it's a combination of these other patterns. This is one of the more commonly used VPC patterns, where you have public subnets with an internet gateway that gives them access to internet services and resources. You may have private subnets that are connected to your on-premises data center via VPN connection or direct connect for internal communications and internal access. And this is typically used to provide both the ability to communicate externally as well as internally, and be able to isolate that communication between the two types of access and whatever may be, again, required for those particular resources. So these are some common patterns. Talk about now a little bit about external connectivity that you can provide to your resources when it comes to the resources in your VPC. As we talked about briefly in the previous slide, you have an internet gateway that allows those internal resources to have access to the internet or other AWS services. And this is a highly available VPC component that provides that communication for your resources in the VPC. So that spans multiple availability zones. You don't have to worry about it being a single point of failure. Then you have the NAT gateway. And for those resources that reside within a private subnet, they normally cannot access the internet or access other AWS services within a private subnet. So to provide that type of connectivity and still keep it secure in a private subnet, you leverage the NAT gateway. And the NAT gateway, again, is a highly available VPC component, but one difference to take note of with the NAT gateway is, whereas the internet gateway spans multiple availability zones, the NAT gateway is highly available, but within that availability zone. So for your applications that you're building in a highly available fashion, you want to make sure that you deploy a NAT gateway in each of the availability zones that your application is being deployed in, and in this case, SharePoint, for example. Then we also have VPN connectivity that we offer to our customers so that they can connect their on-premises data centers to the VPC resources. You can do that by leveraging the virtual private gateway and deploying a VPN, or leveraging Direct Connect, which is our high throughput fiber service that you can cross over directly into one of our regions from your data center and have high throughput connectivity between your on-premises data center and AWS. You also might notice there on the slide, there are two VPN that are being displayed there. One of them is leveraging the virtual private gateway. That's typically what most customers do when they're connecting their on-premises VPNs or establishing a VPN with their on-premises data center. But others may leverage partner solutions, and you can deploy VPNs on instances within AWS and connect that back to your on-premises data center as well. So that's another option, and that's what you see there as far as the second VPN example that's being displayed there. Now, with regards to Active Directory and SharePoint, you have many different options to choose from. You can extend your existing on-premises Active Directory environment into AWS by, again, establishing external connectivity by placing a VPN or a direct connect between your on-premises data center and AWS, and then deploying an EC2 instance in the VPC, deploying Windows Server on it, enabling it as a domain controller, and just essentially extending your Active Directory into AWS and making AWS another site within your Active Directory. Or you can leverage our AWS Directory service. We have a Microsoft managed Active Directory service that we make available to our customers that they can use within AWS. And that would be its own forest within AWS, but we would manage the underlying instances, the operating system, the patch management for those domain controllers, and you would just be concerned with managing your Active Directory environment and still having access to the feature-rich capabilities that an enterprise Microsoft Active Directory environment can provide to you, but in a managed service scenario. And in this case, you would set up a directory trust if you needed to provide connectivity between your on-premises Active Directory and the AWS directory service by creating a forest trust, for example, between your on-premises data center and the service within AWS. In the other example, we see federated trust, so that's also an option, and this requires deploying an ADFS environment for you to set up federation, or leveraging a SAML compliant solution that provides that federation for you between your on-premises environment and AWS. Now, with regards to remote access, you want to be able to manage your environment when you deploy SharePoint on AWS. So what's the best way to do that? So one thing we recommend is to take advantage of the quick start that we've created for remote desktop gateway. It deploys a remote desktop gateway environment for you in a public subnet that provides secure connectivity to your internal resources within AWS. So now you're not opening up holes unnecessarily, or providing more access than what's needed to your environment from whether it's on-prem in your own data center or whether it's external access via the internet. You're securing that access to those resources so that you can manage and administer those internal resources within AWS. And as I mentioned, we do have a quick start, and Slatin will talk about that a little bit later as far as the quick starts are concerned, but they automate the deployment of resources and applications within AWS for you. So definitely take advantage of those. We have them for SharePoint as well. Now, one of the last things we'll talk about in the fundamentals section is purchasing options. So there are many options for you as a customer that leverages Microsoft that you can take advantage of within AWS. You can buy licenses from AWS, of course, by going with the license included option. So that would be license included options in our Windows AMIs, as well as our SQL Server AMIs with Windows, and you basically pay for what you use. And there's no upfront costs or long-term investments in licensing that you have to make when you go with that option. But if you've already made an investment in licenses and you own quite a few Microsoft licenses and you want to take advantage of those, then you have the option as well to bring your own licenses to AWS and just extend the life cycle of your software without actually taking on any additional costs there with regards to the licenses. So we won't go deep into the licensing. There's quite a bit to learn about bringing your own licenses to AWS, but we've had other sessions on that I would encourage you to look at. We've got some references at the end of this deck, and then of course you'll have access to all the sessions, and would encourage you to take a look at that as well. But simply put, we have many options for you as far as licensing is concerned within AWS for Microsoft workloads. And then the last thing I'll mention is with regards to the marketplace. Over 2,300 products are available, one-click deployments for solutions, Microsoft workloads on AWS, including several SharePoint 2013 and 2016 builds that range from single server environments to multiple server environments for you to choose from. So would encourage you to take a look at the marketplace as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Slatin, and he'll cover the architectural scenarios.
Well, thank you very much, Lou. So let's dive into the architectural scenarios. So one of the first things I wanted to talk to you about is effectively the marketplace offering. What's great about marketplace offering and how it ties into the whole licensing talk that Lou gave you. Specifically, when it comes to like, with respect to your, let's say, enterprise agreements and licensing that you've purchased, one thing that you don't have flexibility on with a lot of platforms is ability to actually rent a license in addition to renting, the infrastructure behind it and running it together. And this is what Marketplace is really great for, is that you don't have to, if your need for using SharePoint servers or for developing on them or for specific projects increases during the course of the year, it doesn't really mean that you need to go ahead and pre-purchase additional licensing at your respective true-ups. It means that you can effectively just rent it, use it for as much as you need to use it, and and then basically shut it down, and you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to pay extra or anything like that. So it turns out like quite a big deal, quite a good deal on that side. There are several partners that do offer. We even have an AMI with like, I think it's only the SharePoint Foundation earlier, one of the earlier versions, I believe it's 2010. However, you do have SharePoint 2016 offered by Cognosis with a one-click deployment. You have data resolution, has SharePoint 2013. Cognosis also has 2013, 2010 flavors. It gives you the ability to go ahead and deploy basically complete fairly simplified workloads. As you can see, you will have everything from Active Directory, SQL Server 2014, and SharePoint 2016. You can go ahead, use it to either kick the tires or rather you can do that with quick starts as well, and I'll kind of get onto that as well. But in this particular case, you can use it for development. You can use it for some temporary proofs of concept or any other testing or anything that you need to do, and you don't have additional licensing to use it for. There's also several options for disaster recovery, and disaster recovery is another aspect and another very common scenario for running SharePoint workloads in AWS. That's kind of usually the first also option for a lot of customers that are just migrating into AWS and shifting all of their workloads over there. Because it actually helps you with both. It helps you with your migration scenario. It also provides you with a DR scenario in case you need to effectively fail over. And it saves you, whatever DR solution you may be or may not be using at that point. So the common scenarios are, depending on your RPO and RTO, if it's fairly flexible, the backup and restore scenarios are there. Something in between would be Pilot Lite, and we'll cover those in more detail. And then there's also warm site. You do have also a hot site, a hot standby, where is probably by far the most expensive option that you would have, and that's probably in a case when you're doing an actual full migration or something like that, that you would actually stand up a full hot site, which means the equivalent farm that you would be running on premise. You actually go ahead and deploy in AWS, and then just cut over to that farm instead on AWS side, and that way perhaps migrate or just use it as a really expensive DR scenario, so quite honestly. Backup and restore scenario, we do have a storage appliance called AWS storage gateways that actually allow you to back up specifically SharePoint and respective databases, and then go ahead and replicate those over to S3 in AWS. And then you would be able to effectively automate then deployment of the farm in AWS side via CloudFormation, and I will talk to you more about CloudFormation a little bit later. CloudFormation would build out, which is basically our infrastructure as a code. It would build out your entire infrastructure, and it would automate, as part of it, we can automate the restoring of these specific backups, as well as connecting to the same and getting the farm back up and running. And this is, some people wouldn't call this a DR scenario, but a lot of people do call it, in a sense that they go like, hey, I have fully DevOps optimized, fully automated deployment of my full production environment in AWS. I don't want to run anything on it, so I don't want to spend a dime on AWS in case I need it. And by the way, I can afford for my, for a downtime to be a couple of hours. And remember, downtime is also a matter of perception, because downtime may be, or no downtime may be a fact that you can just switch over your databases to read-only, while you're effectively doing this, and then while you're actually failing over to AWS, they could be still using SharePoint in read-only mode, and then once you cut over, then they can continue using it the way they did before. Pilot Light. Pilot Light refers to running the lowest common denominator as far as your farm is concerned. So that would effectively mean that you do use something like transactional log shipping, or you could be using, earlier mirroring, or you could be using asynchronous always-on availability group that goes in the, and replicates the data over to AWS. And then you would have the absolute minimum of, like, let's say, web front-end and application server. So a simple 2-server farm that will, allow you to go ahead and quickly spin up in an automated fashion additional servers to then withstand any workload or anything like that. What this allows you to do is that it clearly speeds up the time of deployment, considerably, because you have already a running SQL server, a running application server, running web server, and so you have some time and leeway to actually go ahead and increase that, and they can already, even in that state, you can accept some traffic and serve some of that content and some of those transactions. The warm site scenario would effectively be that you don't have something like an automatic, that's the kind of difference between the whole warm site and hot standby. You don't have any automatic failover. You would also use something like always-on availability groups. You would be replicating the data over, but you would have pretty much more or less, a base setup of a full farm, perhaps, instead of just like a single WFE and single app server, you would have at least redundant app servers and redundant WFEs that can grow into any additional capacity that you need to add as well. So you don't have to, once again, have exact replica of what you're running on-premise, but you could kind of go up to that. But that would mean that these things are kind of running live. And then you would manually kind of fail over once you're satisfied with, with the whole thing, whether it's needed or whether it needs to be automated in some way. Obviously, when I say manual failover, I'm kind of really referring to automating that event, whether it's on purpose or whether it's triggered by some specific action. So now we talked about the DR scenario. So let's talk about the actual typical topology of SharePoint server and the typical deployment of the on-premise SharePoint server. So how many of you are running SharePoint server here? Oh yeah, cool. How many of you are running it on-premise? Everybody, okay, hold the same. So this is gonna be good. So depending on the type of SharePoint server you have running, obviously the topology and everything differs. I would argue that there's not so much difference between 2013 and 2016. There are some services and improvements that have been introduced. One specifically, with MinRole, we'll be discussing that more. So for the most part, you have, speaking out of experience, and this is coming out of the trenches specifically, a lot of our customers, once they're running SharePoint on-premise, they would have things like they would either not have a DR, they would have a DR that they don't quite test out. So the whole DR would be kind of either kind of backup and restore scenario, or it would be something more similar to a pilot light type scenario, where it's running over, mostly based on log shipping, over to a DR site with some level of automation to bring it back up. Then some customers would be running things like if they have high bandwidth and they have colo centers and all this sort of stuff, they would be running a stretched farm and things like that. Those are fairly exceptional and expensive scenarios as well in that sense. So there's extremes in both sides, and there's a lot of things in the middle when it comes to that. The only thing that is in common with all these scenarios that I've seen so far is when I ask them, okay, so how often do you test your DR? They go like, never. And I'm like, well, why don't you test it? Because we don't want to break it. So how do you don't know that it's already broken, right? It doesn't make any sense. So one of the things that we strongly encourage when we work with our customers and all that, we implement a scenario for testing specifically the DR scenarios that we have running over there or that they already have running. Some of you guys have probably heard some of our amazing customers and partners and have developed these scenarios such as Chaos Monkey, developed by Netflix in collaboration with us, and the Simian Army and Chaos Gorilla and all that, so in the Janitor Monkey and all those. Those are really great. So who knows what Chaos Monkey does? It will, go ahead. Yeah, it will at random kill servers and test out your DR scenario, right? And then depending on kind of what type of setup you have, you use different types of monkeys to kill, whether it's multiple regions to kill regions at random, to kill availability zones at random, and all that sort of stuff. And then you would get results of that. And those, like I said, all the customers we work with are running those scenarios regularly, and they are forever checking and failing over their production, making sure that it runs. Something I strongly encourage you guys to do as well and consider doing. For the most part, when it comes to actually deploying and moving workloads to AWS specifically, one of the things that is really important to consider is the way we work with our multi-AZ environments, specifically regions and environments. One thing that makes us considerably different than the rest of the cloud providers and all that is the fact that we do not consider that fault tolerance within the same rack amounts to a availability zone. That doesn't make any sense, right? If electricity goes out, everything's gone down. What we consider availability zone to be is a cluster of data centers that is more than 50 miles away from each other, that effectively has, it's in a different fault plane, it's in a different flood plane, there's no natural other disaster that should be able to take out more than one availability zone. As such, these are even for the richest of our customers, right? This actually constitutes very much a DR scenario. Doing a multi-AZ deployment of SharePoint between two AZs is pretty much having just out of the box straight away DR setup of SharePoint, quite honestly, okay? So provided you obviously do not introduce any I would say cowboy scenarios of like deploying updates and things like that to your servers without a controlled and governed way of doing so, you actually at no risk of losing availability as such, right? In a lot of the cases, if you were to say, let's say, apply patching or something like that, you would perhaps consider doing something similar to blue-green deployments, where you go ahead and bring up the same farm on the other side, and then you go ahead and you update the patches or whatever the case is, and then you shift over between the farms. You don't need to do that, essentially, and I'll discuss that a little bit later, because SharePoint supports rolling updates, specifically SharePoint 2016, so we'll discuss that. This is the AWS multi-AZ design patterns. Like I said, we have fiber optic low latency links. So although it appears, like I said, they're very closely together, and when you create separate subnets that have the redundant workloads on all that side, you're effectively providing extremely performant stretch farm to an extent, right? Between that is fully available and that can constitute a better solution than a full disaster recovery solution with the production farm that you've had previously. So first I'm going to go over the 2013, the multi-AZ. So this is what it looks like. If you right now search for AWS Quick Start, you're going to get a whole bunch of basically architectures that we've developed, and all you really need to do, and I'll kind of take you through how to go ahead and deploy those, this is the type of architecture that they deploy, right? And this is kind of a normal type of architecture for our customers that want to go ahead and just extend or migrate SharePoint workloads into AWS, want to have them running, or several other workloads or something like that. So you would first of all have the RD gateways, remote desktop gateways that are set up. Those effectively work. They're redundant, and they allow you to do RDP over HTTPS, and they allow you to effectively go ahead. They act as a bastion server. So they allow you to administer and access all the servers that you have in all the other subnets. And you have the VPC net gateway, as Lou has mentioned early on. That is effectively used for network translation, allowing secure servers that are not exposed to the internet, but they're internal in private subnets. It allows them to pull updates via the internet without exposing them to the internet, right? So it allows you to securely pull updates from the internet for that. And, and before I actually go on that, most importantly, you need to drop DC servers, redundant ADs. Mostly, as most of you know, this is kind of a requirement for just about any cloud solution or anything. The enterprise workloads like SharePoint are very chatty, and as such, they need to be in close proximity to DC servers. So as such, that's a base requirement. Another thing to consider is that you could be running our managed Active Directory, which is part of the AWS directory services. And that way, you don't have to worry about it. We effectively manage that bit. You define how you want it deployed, redundancy behind it and all that. The only thing that is different is if you start migrating more of your infrastructure over to AWS, what you're going to have is you will need to kind of put AD and any central services that you're using in kind of a central VPC, so to speak. And we call that a hub and spoke model. So where you would create a hub, because now each of the VPCs on each of the other solutions, so you could be deploying Exchange in a different VPC, in a different network. You could be deploying Skype for Business. You could be deploying Dynamics AX and all that, and different teams could be working on it. They could be even different accounts or anything. You would effectively have your VPN or your direct connect from your data center configured with the central or the hub VPC that is running AD and all the other central services, and then you would have VPC peering to all the other VPCs that it's using. So that's just the difference in that sense. This is your typical deployment for SharePoint 2013. You have, and this has been in 2010 in a sense and all that, you have web front ends that are redundant. They are load balanced. In this particular case, very important to note, as you can see, what we commonly use is AWS ELB. It is an industry standard load balancer that is a great addition and can be worked with, can be used in addition to autoscaler for bringing up additional instances where and how necessary. However, what's important to note is that ELB does not support NTLM for load balancing because it's a fairly archaic authentication method. What it does support, you need to make sure, and what in fact even the later versions of SharePoint kind of force you to use is claims-based authentication or Kerberos if you prefer it. I like Kerberos, very easy to set up. Some people are really scared because they, when it breaks, they don't know how to fix it. But either of the two, you need to set up that delegation if you were to use AWS ELB. If you're not going to use it, you will need to use an appliance like F5 or NetScaler. You do have those available and many others, right? You have those available in our marketplace, and you can just get to use those in whatever the case is. So that's totally up to you. So yeah, this would be traditional kind of 2 data sets of pattern. This is probably the most common one that I've seen being used. You can actually also have that running where you can have the actual DR set up in another region. So as I said earlier, for a DR perspective, probably I would struggle to justify, because of the way our availability zones work, I would struggle to justify why you need to have this running in another region, right? But what it does give you for a lot of our customers, and if you come to my session as well tomorrow, it's WIN304. It's a great way of also migrating in case you need to migrate to multiple regions. So you want to kind of lower the latency of people accessing SharePoint for your organization that is kind of deployed across the globe. So it's a great way to bring it up and create additional, call it DR farms in other regions, and then fail over to them, or just disconnect them and then get those specific regions to use them. That involves setting up a VPN. It's a fairly fast VPN. I'll be doing a demo of that tomorrow. Come check it out. The scenario is going to be basically SQL-based. I'll be showing you how that the actual asynchronous replication works with the always-on availability groups. They'll be all part of the same WSFC. Yeah, so the VPN that we commonly use, instead we use just OpenVPN, and it's kind of set up between one region to another, because you can't VPC peer between regions, right? You don't have transitive routing on that level or any. Great. So 2016. So how many of you are running 2016? Nobody. One? No. 1, 2. Okay, good stuff. So I'm going to be talking about MinRole, because I'd like you to use MinRole, and you should be using MinRole. You guys know what MinRole is? Okay. So a whole lot of people were really confused as kind of all the services and all the offerings grew with SharePoint for a long time. So I've been around as since 2001, when SharePoint 2001 came up, and content management server and all that sort of stuff afterwards, and all this, to 2003 to 2007, and so on and so on. These specific, how it grew was enormous, right? And the amount of services that it could take, and that it had, capabilities, features that were added to it, they were literally leapfrogging from one version to another, where you were effectively dealing with a totally different solution with a totally different product altogether. And as such, it became also more and more complicated. One of the biggest things that one of the complaints from the customers to Microsoft in generally from the community in the industry was when it comes to actually deploying a farm, there was just too much that you had to consider around which service is going to go where. They did an amazing thing when they deployed SharePoint 2010. They did the SharePoint service architecture, which actually allowed you to create individual services that will self-load balancing, which was amazing. And then, you would then decide, depending on which service does what, so that you don't have like a disproportionate kind of resource utilization. You would split that up in different server roles. You call them server roles or whatever the case is. So, I don't know, you would split up search servers different from all the BI services. You would split up the indexer on the search side, and you would define how that's going to be available and how that's, how that is going to utilize the resources and monitoring and all that. That, unfortunately, was fairly complicated for a lot of the customers. They would have to hire very expensive people like myself to go there and tell them the stuff and all that. So Microsoft simplified it a lot by introducing min roles. And what min roles do is that they predefine the role of a server. Another great thing that the min roles do is that they make sure only that those services that are meant to run on that server are running on that server. So it's kind of going to work like a desired state configuration type thing, where you're going to have actually a job that is periodically running on individual min role servers, and it's going to make sure that first of all those servers are up and running, and that nobody has introduced some other service, and it would, if it does find that service, it would kill it. Right? And that's very important to note, because in case you have some specific customizations and stuff that you've introduced, you've got to take that into account. Otherwise, the min role might kill it. So that's very important to note. But it made it great. These were like the four specific roles that you had. You had the front end, you had the search, you had distributed cache, and you had the application role. Right? A lot easier than like, oh, where's my business connectivity services going to be running? Oh, where's my Excel services going to be running? Oh, where's this going to be running? Where's that going to be running? Between these four, you basically have all the services and all the features that you need, right? Which is great, which is exactly what you want, right? And as such, however, that's the minimum that you're going to have for a farm. So if you were to make these things redundant, you would need to have, for high availability, you would need to have 8 servers, right? So this is kind of a setup and all that, that you would have your web front ends. How many of you know what distributed cache servers are? How many of you are using distributed cache? Oh, you are? Okay, good. So what distributed cache servers are, that's the old App Fabric. And maybe you guys will remember what the App Fabric was. App Fabric basically was providing caching for all the transactions, and before committing them to the database, and as such, it was considerably speeding up all the transactions that are going in and out from the front ends, right? So you would have the front ends, they go via distributed cache servers and all that. So for those of you that have actually worked with App Fabric in the past, you'll know in order to establish a quorum, it's not enough just to have 2. You need to have 3 distributed cache servers. And I'll talk about if you do run 2, because a lot of people do run 2. And you'll see in all the Microsoft documentation and stuff, they put up 2 and all that sort of stuff. The only thing that you need to worry about if you're running 2 is that you need to do a very graceful restart when you're doing an update. And what you need to understand is that whatever the cache part was on the server that you were about to restart, once it goes offline, that thing is not going to get replicated to the other one. For that, you need 3 servers, right? So that will be offline until it actually comes back on, and that's something to consider. Okay, so yeah, you have the application service, and then you have the search service. Search service, as you know, is fairly important because of the enterprise search capabilities of SharePoint, since Microsoft purchased Fast Search from Norway, which is an amazing product, and that gave them amazing search capabilities and all these great things that they've built in Office 365, like Delve and so on. Okay, so same goes for the SQL Server and domain controllers in this particular case. Yeah, and it supports no downtime patching. Yeah, so as such, the min role also makes sure that it's aware of when you're patching it, when you're bringing it down, and how to route the traffic, the transactions for specific servers. Another thing that is very common is adding the Office Online Server. Office Online Server, as you know, this is what the capability that it offers to you to actually run Office applications in the server, the licensing for, rather in the web pages of SharePoint. So you are able to do a collaboration and stuff, like Google Docs, right? You can have multiple people, they have multi-conflict engine, and you can all work on the Word document or Excel together at the same time, and it will maintain everybody's changes at the same time and all that great stuff that you might want to use. However, important thing to understand with the Office Online Server, Office Online Server is a separate SharePoint farm on its own. So, and it's configured as an additional farm to the farm that you're already running. So for those of you that have been running it before, you'll know that particular fact. Office Online Server can be also load balance, which is great, and you could actually use two of them for the actual availability. That's not usually considered. Editing Office documents in a web page is not considered like an RPO and RTO type thing. Nobody cares about it because it's not it's not really doing anything with the data, and people can generally live without it if it goes offline. Right, so a lot of the times people don't really provide redundancy for that, but you can, right? It's really up to you. You guys can figure it out. Yeah, and then other things is with the 2013 workflow platform is using the Workflow Manager server, and then you can actually add that. It's still, even in 2016, it's still called the 2013 workflow platform because it was first introduced in 2013. You can then use those, and you can make those redundant if necessary to provide the workflow functionality that you've been using or migrated over from the previous version, including any new ones that you tend to build or want to build. Feature Pack. So what's great about the Feature Pack 1? Anybody running Feature Pack 1? Nobody? So the Feature Pack 1 allows you, for the min role, to combine multiple roles in the same server. So it combines the front end with distributed cache, and it combines application with search. And that's great because now you can actually run smaller farm. Before in order to run a fully highly available farm, you had to have 8 servers. Now you can have 4 servers. Or if you don't want highly available, you can have 2 versus 4, right? And that's a pretty amazing thing because it allows you to build out smaller environments, smaller test environments, and all this sort of stuff without prerequisite must use of so many servers and all that. Before I go over there, one of the things that I wanted to mention is, what's really important is using the self-healing architecture and taking advantage of our services that we got to offer. So I mentioned already that we have hosted fully managed Microsoft AD through AWS Directory Services. I mentioned already AWS CLB that helps you in this particular sense. But also there's you can use the autoscaler with the ELB specifically. It's kind of tricky, and I'll tell you why. A couple of things. You can only scale up to as much licensing as you have, right? Because now the licensing is all per server stuff, right? So that's one thing to consider. You can't just burst out as much as you want. Second of all, you have to understand, that traditionally when you going and deploying servers through launch configuration, and for those of you that are not familiar with autoscaler and the launch configuration, I urge you to look that up. That's kind of a basics from an AWS side of things. But launch configuration would use our AMI, and then it would bootstrap it, and then it would go ahead and bring up the server. So as you understand, a lot of things need to happen to it. It needs to be added to the domain. The services need to be installed, deployed, and all this sort of stuff. Of course, a lot of this stuff can be pre-done. You can pre-create these things and create a custom AMI to do so. You can even, and that will require, of course, a lot less automation. It will take a lot less time to bring it back up. You can go one forward because, hey, what you have, you already have all the licensing for all the servers. You can bring about the biggest farm you can possibly build, right? And with all the additional redundancy. And then, because you don't need all that capacity, you can just shut down things you don't need. So you can just stop them and configure in the actual autoscaler to bring them back up when necessary. Because you've stopped them, you're not paying for them anymore, right? But they're there and you can self-heal and you can bring them back up. If any issue happens, if any if they go down for whatever reason or anything like that, you can the autoscaler, depending on a health rule, will actually can bring it back up or add additional capacity whenever you need it fairly quickly. So that's one thing another thing to consider. So I told you about all these things. I told you about, all these architectures, all these DR scenarios and all that. But one thing that I was telling you about as well, specifically if you remember on the backup and restore scenarios when DR and all that, is the automated way of creating SharePoint architecture in the sense. So if you go to the Quick Start, once again, go ahead and search AWS Quick Start, and you will get all different ones, including the SharePoint 2016. It will create, basically once you click the button, it will create this full infrastructure. It's based on CloudFormation. CloudFormation is our infrastructure as a code. It's basically JSON that you have several templates and all this sort of stuff. Like all these production stuff is already pre-created for you. You can just go ahead and change it and adjust it. Why is it JSON? Because you can either create it yourself, you can create it in Visual Studio. We have for Visual Studio SDK for AWS, we actually have templates for creation of CloudFormation templates. And you can then go ahead and code this out, or there's a lot of things like programmatic tools and other CDCR platforms that actually can go ahead and create CloudFormation for you. Things like Troposphere, like Terraformer, and so on. Those are free tools. You can specifically Troposphere. It's like a GitHub project. You can check it out. For those of you that are Python developers, if you happen to be there. And what's great about it is that you can create stacks, because by default, when you run a CloudFormation, if something happens, or if one of your services did not start, or one of your parts of your infrastructure was not configured properly during the course of it, first of all, that's highly unlikely, but it can happen with respect to how you're configuring stuff. Because for most part, it's an explicit schema-based language. You just tell them what it needs to do, and our service figures out what needs to be deployed in what order, right? So you don't have to worry about that. The thing comes into when they actually installing services and adding themselves to a domain and all this sort of stuff, where things can happen. And that's something to worry about. In those cases, sometimes the actual CloudFormation script can roll back, and it will start deleting everything that it created. That it does by default. You can uncheck that, so it doesn't do that for you. But should you check that and like it, you can also split it up into multiple different stacks, and those are different scripts, and have a master script that executes these stacks one by one. That way, it won't roll back. You can create, in this case, AD, SQL stack, and then SharePoint stack last. And it won't roll back the SQL stack and AD because it's, you already did it. And then any changes that you do subsequently, you can update. So what does it look like? Exactly. All this great stuff that I'm telling you, is it as simple as I'm telling you? Well, I think so. First thing that you need, if you haven't done this already, you need your AWS account. You then would go to the Quick Start, you would press a button, it will actually go ahead and launch directly. Once you logged into the account, it will launch it into CloudFormation. Then you would be asked all these parameters to put in. So actually, CloudFormation auto-creates a form, right, based on the parameters that you've defined. So those parameters in this case are VPC, CIDR range, private subnet, and all that. But it's not just that. It's an EC2 configuration. What you don't see at the bottom is also everything about like service accounts for SharePoint, service accounts for SQL, and so on and so forth. Like what do you want to use for it? What type of what type of instances you want to use, and so on, right? And then all you have to do after that is just configure an availability group. You have to define, you have to select the actual databases to do that, and that's done. The template takes about 3 hours to complete, and I dare any other platform to show me if they can do that faster than us. Because we've done a lot of benchmarks internally and with our customers, and I can guarantee you. And the default template will cost around $12 per hour. For those of you that probably can get some credits and stuff like that from us, that will help you plan out, or if you're going to be using it yourself for whatever, for development or POC purposes or anything like that, that's kind of a guideline just to understand what is it going to take. So best practices. One thing to take note of. Security groups. So security groups is effectively they're basically proxy rules that you put on, and they put on the instance level. You can associate multiple instances with security groups. The resistance to this and understanding of security groups is important, whether you're working with customers yourself if you're a partner, or whether you work with a particular customer. It's difficult for a lot of people to understand the virtualized concepts and versus tin concepts, as I call them, or actual hardware concepts of running a network. And what's really important to understand is that you don't have like something sitting on the VPC or sitting on the subnet. This is kind of your first line of defense, first layer of defense, so to speak, and you apply it individually. It's basically like a proxy that you would apply individually to all the instances. There's different ways and different securities that we create normally, for patterns used for Microsoft deployment specifically. We have like domain security group that is kind of applied to all, and then all the others kind of can inherit and draw from that security group, and then release any other ports that they need to release, let's say for services to talk between each other and so on, and just disallow any other specific traffic just in case. Network ACLs. ACLs basically have the same, except they have allow and deny rules versus only allow rules that you have with security groups. These sit on subnet level, and those are basically something that you use to say when you kind of limiting off the traffic, to say no matter what changes I do to security groups between instances on how they talk to each other, I don't ever want to let something like this come in, right? Or I want to explicitly allow something like this. So explicit deny will always overrule and allow, right? So that's one thing to consider. And this is a good example of that. When it comes to SQL Server specifically, make sure that you are running the right ME and that you're running the right EBS volume types. We have run for a lot of our customers a lot of application and database scenarios and like with our competitive platforms, so to speak, right? And we more than doubled in performance when it comes to that. Our competitive platforms cannot, for example, guarantee IOPS, so something like our provision IOPS SSD can actually guarantee exactly consistent amount of IOPS that is being used. We usually use the memory optimized, which are our instances. So when you look at those, you can use that for more general purpose stuff. There's M instances, specifically M4 class instances. So that's really important to check. Another thing to check is you need to see how many ENIs or elastic, network interfaces is allowed per each instance, because when you creating clusters, specifically, you want to make sure that you have sufficient number of NICs for your specific instances. And then there's also a more than sufficient general purpose SSD that kind of it gives you up to certain amount of IOPS, and those can accumulate if you don't get to use them, right? And I think they set up for the certain amount of IOPS per gigabyte that can burst up to 3,000 IOPS. So that's very important to note. Usually we use the M class stuff for the actual application and web front-end service. So M for 4x large, for example, and that's pretty sufficient one, and that's a good comparable one. We ran application scenarios, and I'm telling you, you will be impressed by the performance. Performance is not just comparable to running it on-premise, but it's better in most case scenarios when we migrated our customers over to AWS. So we don't see running workloads in AWS as like a second-class citizen. We see this where you should be running it as your primary production environment for your SharePoint, right? Very strongly recommend that, unlike others do for other platforms. This is always on availability group set up, with some details with the AG listener and all that. This is a very typical setup. Tomorrow I'll show you how the failover happens between regions and all that with kind of asynchronous scenario. That's also a good way to simulate how it would happen if you were doing a failover and using AWS as a DR site, which is this type of scenario. I already showed you that. I already showed you how the VPN, and we talked about setting up VPN between two regions or between your data center and or your colo and AWS specifically. I will go briefly through the migration stuff. There are, the migration strategy, I think the good chunk of it is based on the DR scenarios that we've put together. That's something that we do recommend. Things like blue-green deployments, for those of you that are aware or perhaps not aware, that involves effectively bringing up another environment and then just, cutting over to that one. That's fairly cheap and possible to do in AWS because you can just temporarily rent those resources from us and then have that brought up and then kill the environment that you don't need. Some of the things to consider, I mean, it's same that the DB attach method and checking the compatibility aspects before you kind of migrate from one version to another. You know very well you can't skip versions, and you need to be aware of any compatibility issues for any legacy features that you're bringing over from already migrated SharePoint farms. I will be around. I can take offline questions specifically for migration. That's a whole session on its own, so I'm not going to dwell too much on that. Make sure you're using EC2 config to, you can actually stream all your logs, IS logs, perf-mon logs, all the application system logs. You can stream it to CloudWatch, which already monitors the CPU and disk use and IOPS usage and all that sort of stuff. And then together with that, you can directly monitor using CloudWatch logs. And those can also be shot through Amazon Kinesis. Kinesis is a service that allows fast real-time processing of any type of data, including log. We commonly use it for log data, and that can send it to your log system that you may be using, or you can just send it to an Elk Stack or to Elasticsearch with Kibana on our side that we got to offer, and then you can kind of analyze that stuff. And now we also have, we support queries and analytics on Kinesis stream itself, and then you can kind of run those as it's coming through. Another thing that you can do, you can set up alarms on it. You can automate any action that needs to be done. You can automate a lot of simple actions like restarting servers and all this sort of stuff, or stopping servers or terminating instances. But you can also use AWS Lambda, which is your stateless kind of serverless service to automate any other action, further. Like, I don't know, inform you to your to a specific chat application as a bot to tell you what it is, and you can kind of send commands from Slack back to your farm and instruct it to do some specific administration task. So that's that. There's a lot more to that. I encourage you to come over and talk to me about it. Besides the notification, like I said, just to note one more time, the alarms can send you via SNS, can start a workflow, can send you an email, or they can send you an actual SMS to your phone and inform you about specific events that you wanted to subscribe to for your SharePoint farm. That's it. Thank you very much.